Hi guys, welcome back to our channel.
Hello. How's it going?
We are back with another reaction. Today we're going to be checking out facts about slavery never mentioned in schools. I actually checked it out on my channel and I watched it alone. So there were so many things I kind of missed out. And when I rewatched it again, I was kind of thinking maybe I can talk a little bit more. And I wanted my husband to also tell me what he thinks about what he's going to watch. This is by Thomas Sowell. Yeah, so yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure who that is, to be honest.
Okay, let's check this out. Mhm.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were...
Okay. When I was in primary school, I think the first thing I remember was during the history lessons, was when they were talking about Egypt and the pyramids. This is like kind of my first finding out about slavery, because, they told us basically in school that there were like large amounts of slaves used to build pyramids. So this was always kind of, when someone mentioned slavery, for me, this was kind of the first thing that came to my mind, because that's what I remember from school.
I actually used to think, like in my mind, I used to feel like slavery was all about racism. But this is just so clear that it totally wasn't about racism. Yeah.
When we watched, I don't remember now, like obviously the Norse history is a different thing, and it's not something that I've learned in school. But if you watch the movies, especially like the TV series Vikings, they were going like sailing the boat to a different continent or like country, plundering basically, stealing like gold or whatever valuables, and also taking slaves. You remember? And they were taking back with them and then using them in their villages to do like, different stuff, different work.
That's interesting.
and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked.
Okay.
The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans. Asians enslaved other Asians. Africans enslaved other Africans. And
Yeah, you see, like it kind of all happened, within, your own continent in a way. Like Europe had slaves, taken just like from different countries and so on.
Yeah, I never used to think that it happens just within like Africans enslaving Africans and Europeans enslaving Europeans. I never used to occur to me. I used to feel like, okay, maybe they take slaves from African to the Europe, and it just felt that I just feel like Africans wouldn't enslave Africans. I didn't know that they actually do it within themselves. I didn't actually imagine it that way, because most times when I watch in movies, I see like Africans being enslaved by Europeans and all that. So that's what I always see. But listening to this, it happens that actually Africans actually enslaves Africans, and they said mostly the slaves are like the vulnerables.
Yeah, people that cannot defend themselves in a way, or something along those lines, I guess. I think it must have been like the whole world, really, to be honest.
Yeah. I don't know if it adds to someone's kind of is it prestige, like a rich, maybe you have the numbers of slaves you have working for you. I don't know if that what it does for them then.
As he was saying, it was probably difficult to travel, first of all, such a long distance. It would take like crazy amount of effort, money, to try and sail somewhere across the sea. If you think about it now, it's almost unthinkable. Like no one really in today's world would think about something like that, to really sell someone, to someone else.
Yeah, somehow I still feel there's still some of that practice going on secretly or hidden illegally somewhere.
It's something for me that's unimaginable. Like, I don't know how to say that differently. It's not something that I would even cross my mind.
Wow. Okay.
Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders and other...
I think that most obvious reason for me would be religious. I think it would have been more plausible that someone would want to enslave someone based on religion. For example, if I'm Christian and you're not, then I'll be like, you know what I mean? In that situation, I would think that's probably more plausible than race.
Yeah.
At the time. Because I think the religion was so strong, especially, in olden days, I think, was a lot of people were, believing in different gods, different things. And I think if you find someone who's not believing in your God, then in your own belief, you might be like, okay,
But it's surprising that it's not actually race, because for me, I would actually, think it's about race, which slavery is totally a very, bad thing. I just can't even imagine how it was. Even just from the picture, the graphics here alone, it looks terrible. Being treated like animals. And I think they're bounded in chains, both hands and legs, and being whipped. And it's crazy. It's unimaginable.
African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891,
see neighbors, neighboring countries and so on,
had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy...
Have you watched the miniseries Roots? I heard about it, but I've not watched it.
No.
Basically, they talked about it, and from the series, I think it talks a bit more about slavery and all, but I've not watched it as well, so maybe it'd be nice to check it out. But I know it's all fictional, but this is the reality, the real truth and facts about it all.
We watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by. This instrumental use of history, or
I try to give them a myth,
is open to the same objections as other instruments."
But I guess, okay, yeah. I mean, I try to give them a myth to live by. So it's, in those words, that it's kind of made up.
Yeah, fictional.
On that statement, that seems like, if that's what the author said, I try to give them a myth. Something to
live by.
Yeah. Mental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making. Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself.
Really?
The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and
Wow.
large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of
Yeah, just remind me when I went to visit Africa, I had to take the anti-malaria
Yeah.
pills. Yeah, you know, if you think about it, some things like that are totally crazy because I think kind of I don't know if there's other parts of the world that are also like that, but you know, in kind of first world countries, it's gotten pretty much like rid of.
It does exist in Africa a lot, like in Nigeria. I know several times I've caught like malaria, but then when it was first, I don't know, discovered or so, but it was really very dangerous because there was no cure, there was no treatment for malaria, so it was really killing really fast. But
I think that's why he's saying that, you know, an average lifespan of a white person coming to that environment will be 1 year only, just because, you know, if you were born there, your body at least has some form of resistance, maybe, you know, to it. But someone who's spent his whole life in Europe coming over, their body or like immune system is not, you know, not used to it. They don't have any resistance.
Malaria is gotten from mostly mosquitoes. You know, there's so many lots of mosquitoes back in Nigeria, my hometown. And so, yeah, you know, every now and then you're like treating malaria. In a year, you can treat malaria like 3-4 times in a year because you get bitten by mosquitoes and there's nothing you can do about it. You know, it's always there. Breeds and live there. Yeah, it's so different since I got here. I've not, you know, gotten sick with malaria. It's like so different, like totally different here.
Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe.
Thinking about when I imagine how Africans enslaves Africans and kind of, you know, sell them and ships them over, that thought is very, I don't know how I feel about it. It's terrible. I just never imagined like, you know, that it would happen, you know, between African and African, doing that to your fellow African.
See, but that's how I was mentioning, for example, religion, you know, then could be just a different country. And as you said, things like this happened in Europe and, you know, different continents. So
it's crazy, really crazy.
African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children.
You see,
the
like
Tutsi
neighbors.
dominated
So I
the
think,
Hutu
you know,
in
there's
Rwanda.
a little difference. Doesn't matter, you know, if it's religion,
and the latter,
different country,
in turn, held the
you know,
Indorobo
race,
in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that, as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before.
Hmm.
The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts. An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean.
Wow.
In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes.
Yeah,
Over the
that's actually kind of, if you think about it, how did it end everywhere?
Yeah.
Because obviously you know about American Civil War, but like rest of the world, like how did it all actually ceased, you know?
As more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came.
Okay.
Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved.
Crazy how it all ended.
Somehow you just stopped hearing about the slavery, and even in school, they don't even really teach or go into details of how. Because I can't really remember if I was even taught anything about like proper, slavery and all this. This is like so detailed and, put in very simple way for you to want to understand and know how it was actually really, done. The whole thing you used to think about slavery is so totally different from what we hear from here.
Yeah, as I said, I think from school, obviously I remember when they were talking about Egypt and the pyramids. That's kind of one thing. And then you learn obviously about America and the Civil War. It's difficult to say because the educational system changes all the time. It might be something that is being taught in the schools now, or I don't know. I really don't know.
Hopefully.
But we had like a very brief mentions of those things. Civil War was quite a big of a topic, or like America's independence, the Civil War and all that.
There's so much to learn from here, actually. Getting to know, the truth about all these things, like it's so important. And I'm actually glad. I hope the part 2 comes out because it's quite interesting to learn about histories, things that have happened in the past that no one mentions. Sometimes they're even like forgotten. You don't even remember until someone mentions and comes up with them, and then you're like, oh, wait, this happened before. And it's kind of like you're feeling like it's all like a dream, but it was actually reality and people lived it. And, some are telling the stories today. You just cannot imagine like unimaginable things that happened during that slavery time. Now you kind of see it in the movies and you kind of feel like, oh, it's fictional. You're just watching something, that someone wrote. But yeah, but when you sit and think about it, after looking at these historical facts, you kind of remember, like, this is what people then went through for real, like live. Some were sold, taken by force from your country, from where you live, to another, another strange land, forcefully being sold. You pay with, I don't know if it's gold, money, or whatever. You're being sold out and it's just a very, I don't know, let's say barbaric or terrible, practice. Thank you all for hanging and checking out this with us. Remember to subscribe to our channel. We'll see you all in the next video. From us, it's bye.
See you later.